Janet's words cut through me like a blade, sharp and deliberate. Do you really think you deserve that money? That trust fund is Tiffany's now. She's so much better than you'll ever be. I clutched the edge of the hotel desk, my grip tightening as I struggled to control my pounding heart. Her voice, laced with satisfaction, echoed through the phone, delivering the news I had somehow always expected. She had drained the trust fund my mother had left for me. My name is Gabriella Mitchell. At 28, I had convinced myself that I had finally escaped the toxic grasp of my family's dysfunction. My career in pharmaceutical sales kept me on the move, traveling across the country week after week. It was supposed to be just another Tuesday in Minneapolis, another night of preparing for an important client meeting. But instead, I found myself listening to Janet gloat about stealing what was meant to be mine. "Thanks for letting me know," I responded, my voice calm and composed, revealing nothing of the storm brewing inside me. I could almost picture the surprise flickering across Janet's face. She had been expecting tears, begging, maybe even anger. But she got none of it. "That's all you have to say?" she asked, frustration seeping into her tone. "Tiffany needs that money for her wedding and her new house. And you? You would have just wasted it on your meaningless sales job." I thought of my mother, the woman who had built a business from the ground up and secured that trust fund so I could have a future of my own. She had passed away when I was 16, and 2 years later, my father had married Janet. From the moment she entered our lives, she had been fixated on that money, scheming for ways to claim it as her own. "Is there anything else?" I asked, my tone steady and unwavering. Silence. Janet had no idea that 6 months earlier, I had met with Mr. Harrison, my mother's longtime attorney. He had reached out to warn me about her suspicious inquiries regarding the trust. Together, we had taken the necessary precautions, setting up legal safeguards that made unauthorized access impossible and, more importantly, punishable. "You've always been such a disappointment," Janet sneered, taking one last shot at provoking me. "Your stepsister deserves that money far more than you ever did." I ended the call, my eyes drifting to the Minneapolis skyline outside my hotel window. My hands trembled, but not from fear. Every step Janet had taken, every attempt she had made to manipulate the situation, it was all documented. She had finally crossed the line, and I was ready to act. Growing up with Janet had been like walking on eggshells. When my mother lost her battle with cancer, my father, desperate to rebuild the life we had lost, remarried quickly. Janet arrived with her daughter, Tiffany, who was 13 at the time, and the household dynamic shifted immediately. My mother had worked tirelessly to establish her pharmaceutical consulting business, ensuring that I would have a secure future. The trust fund she left me wasn't just a sum of money, it was a symbol of her legacy, a promise that she would continue to protect me even after she was gone. But Janet saw it as an unfair advantage, something Tiffany was entitled to as well. "Your mother wouldn't want you to be selfish," she used to say, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "We're a family now. We should share." But we weren't a family. Not really. As my father buried himself in work to escape his grief, Janet took full control of the household, ensuring that I was pushed further and further into the background. Tiffany became the center of attention, her every achievement, no matter how minor, was celebrated while my successes went largely unnoticed. Even when I earned scholarships, got accepted into a top business school, and excelled academically, it barely registered. Janet controlled what my father saw, painting a picture that suited her narrative. The moment I truly understood my place in that house came on the day of my college graduation. I had graduated at the top of my class, secured a prestigious job, and had done it all while working part-time to support myself. But my father wasn't there. "Tiffany has a cold," Janet had told me without an ounce of remorse. "She needs her father right now." That was the moment I knew I would never be a priority. Nothing would change unless I made it change. The very next day, I packed my things and moved out, determined to carve out a life of my own. Despite the years of distance, Janet never stopped making comments about how fortunate I was while Tiffany had to struggle. She constantly framed my success as some undeserved privilege, a stroke of luck that Tiffany had been unfairly denied. 6 months ago, when Mr. Harrison called to alert me about Janet's inquiries into the trust, everything fell into place. She had been playing a long game, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. But she had underestimated me. I was no longer that vulnerable 16-year-old. I was my mother's daughter, and she had taught me well. Sitting in my hotel room that evening, I reached into my purse and pulled out the small photograph I always carried. My mother's face beamed back at me, strong, confident, and determined. She had built something from nothing, and she had left that trust fund so I could do the same. It wasn't just about money. It was about independence, about securing my future, just as she had envisioned. I inhaled deeply, then reached for my phone, my fingers steady as I dialed Mr. Harrison's number. The call connected on the second ring. His familiar voice came through, steady and reassuring. Janet had finally made her move. I got straight to the point. She claims she transferred everything to Tiffany. I was expecting this, he responded without hesitation. I received an alert early this morning about an attempt to access the account. But don't worry, Gabriella. The extra security measures we put in place worked exactly as intended. Every attempt was logged and thoroughly documented. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. So, nothing was actually transferred? Not a single penny, he confirmed. But this gives us undeniable proof of her attempted fraud. The documentation is airtight. Should I move forward with the next steps? He asked. I thought about everything: years of manipulation, the subtle but constant jabs, the way Janet had slowly driven a wedge between my father and me. She had been so sure of herself, so confident in her control over the situation, that she never even considered the possibility that I might be ahead of her. Yes, I said decisively. It's time to put an end to this. Send everything to the family lawyer and copy my dad on it. I want him to see exactly what his wife tried to do. Consider it done, Mr. Harrison assured me. Then his voice softened. And Gabriella, your mother would be proud. She always said you were sharper than anyone ever gave you credit for. After ending the call, I opened my laptop and booked an earlier flight home. My client meeting would have to wait. Right now, my family situation demanded my full attention. This time, I would be the one in control. I arrived in Boston the next morning, stepping out into the crisp autumn air. The house I had grown up in looked unchanged from the outside, yet something about it felt different. Maybe it was me. I had called ahead to let my dad know I was coming, though I hadn't mentioned Janet's phone call. Some discussions needed to happen face to face. Inside, I found them all gathered in the living room: Dad, Janet, and Tiffany. The confident smirk on Janet's face wavered the moment she saw me walk in. Confusion flickered in her eyes as she took in my calm demeanor. Gabriella, my father said, his expression lined with concern. I wasn't expecting you until later. Is everything all right? Actually, Dad, we need to talk. I reached into my bag and retrieved my phone, pulling up the file Mr. Harrison had sent me. Yesterday, Janet called to inform me that she had emptied my trust fund and given everything to Tiffany. I thought you should see exactly what happened. Janet's face drained of color. I was only trying to help Tiffany. Don't, I interrupted, my voice firm as steel. Every attempt you made to access the account was recorded. Every call, every forged signature, every single manipulation, it's all documented. I handed my father the file. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with each new piece of evidence. Janet, his voice was barely above a whisper. What did you do? She's lying. Tiffany cut in, her face flushing red. She's always been jealous of me. Without hesitation, I pulled out another document, the official trust fund statement. The money is still there, untouched and secure. Janet's attempts to take it failed because I knew what she was planning months ago. I took precautions. Precautions? Janet repeated, her voice laced with fury. You set me up. No, I said, keeping my tone even. I protected what was mine, just as my mother taught me to do. The silence in the room was suffocating as my father continued flipping through the documents. Each piece of evidence laid out the calculated effort Janet had made to deceive him. Every email she had sent to the bank. Every attempt to forge his signature. Every single move designed to take what didn't belong to her. I did this for our family, Janet insisted, though her voice wavered now. Tiffany needed. Stop. My father's voice cracked as he cut her off. Just stop, Janet. He lifted his gaze from the pages in his hands, his eyes filled with a kind of pain I hadn't seen since my mother passed away. You forged my signature. You lied to the bank. His voice faltered before he turned to look at me. Gabriella, I had no idea. Of course, you didn't, I said gently. Janet made sure of that. Mr. Harrison had arranged everything in chronological order, years of Janet's subtle and not-so-subtle attempts to erode my father's trust in me while maneuvering to get her hands on my inheritance. The final pages detailed her most recent failed attempt, along with the frustrated calls she had made to the bank afterward. This is absurd, Tiffany burst out, standing abruptly. Mom was just trying to make things fair. Gabriella has always had everything handed to her. I turned to my stepsister, feeling a mixture of exasperation and pity. Handed to me? I echoed. I worked my way through college. I built my career from the ground up. I never once touched that trust fund. Mom left it to me so I would have choices, just like she did. But Janet couldn't accept that, could she? At that moment, Janet's carefully composed mask finally cracked. You ungrateful little. I've already filed charges, I cut her off without hesitation. The bank has every piece of evidence they need to prove attempted fraud. Mr. Harrison is handling everything. Then I turned to my father. I'm sorry you had to learn about it this way, but you needed to know the truth. The weight of 12 years of manipulation pressed down on the room like a suffocating force. My father looked at Janet as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time, and what he saw wasn't good. Then, everything changed. My father stood, his hands still shaking as he clutched the damning documents. Janet, his voice was resolute, I want you out of this house. Tonight? What? Janet's voice escalated into a sharp, incredulous pitch. You can't be serious. After everything I've done for this family? My father's response was quiet yet unwavering. Everything you've done? You tried to steal from my daughter. You forged my signature. You've been deceiving me for years. Tiffany began to cry, but this time, the tears weren't her usual manipulative display. Her expression shifted into something different, genuine shock. It seemed she was finally grasping the severity of what her mother had attempted. The police will want to speak with you, I informed Janet. Mr. Harrison has already reported everything. The bank's fraud department is involved now. Janet's expression twisted into anger. You set this up. You knew I would try to access the trust fund. No, Janet, I corrected, meeting her gaze. You planned this. I simply made sure I was prepared when you did. I turned toward my father. There's more. Mr. Harrison found evidence that she's been siphoning money from your accounts as well. Small amounts over the years, but they add up. My father sank into his chair, the weight of betrayal settling over him. A pang of guilt shot through me for being the bearer of such painful news, but he needed to hear it. Get out, he said again, his voice heavy with finality. Both of you. My lawyer will be in touch regarding the divorce. As Janet and Tiffany hurriedly gathered their belongings, they hurled accusations and tears in equal measure. I stood by the window, silent, watching the scene unfold. It was the same window where I had once waited for my mother to come home from work. I could almost hear her voice in my mind. Always be prepared, sweetheart, and never let anyone take what is rightfully yours. In the weeks that followed, my father and I had long overdue conversations. One evening, we sat in the kitchen, the same place where my mother used to help me with my homework. For the first time in years, we truly talked. I failed you, my father admitted, staring into his coffee. After your mother passed, I was so afraid of being alone that I ignored what was happening right in front of me. We both made mistakes, I admitted. I should have told you sooner about Janet, but I wanted proof. I needed you to see it for yourself. The legal proceedings progressed swiftly. Janet faced charges of attempted fraud and financial exploitation. She tried to cast herself as a victim, insisting she had only wanted to balance things between Tiffany and me, but the overwhelming evidence told a different story. The bank's documentation exposed years of calculated efforts to access my trust fund. Not long after, I received an email from Tiffany. She claimed she had no idea about her mother's schemes. "I'm sorry," she wrote. "I always believed you had everything handed to you. Mom made it seem like you were the privileged one, but now I realize she was just envious of what your mother built for you." Meanwhile, with Mr. Harrison's guidance, I took a step toward something I had always dreamed of, starting my own business consulting firm. The trust fund my mother had left me became the foundation for my new venture, just as she had intended. "Your mother would be proud," Mr. Harrison told me one day. "She always said you had her business sense and your father's heart. She knew you would do great things when the time was right." My father began visiting me at the office for lunch every week. Sometimes we reminisced about my mother, sharing memories that Janet had made too painful to discuss for years. Other times, we talked about the future. Slowly, he began to look like himself again, the man he had been before my mother's illness took hold. "You know what your mother used to say about you?" he asked me one afternoon. "She said you were like a diamond. Pressure only made you stronger." Life settled into a new rhythm. My consulting firm grew quickly, attracting clients who valued my straightforward approach and industry expertise. I built a small, dedicated team, including Sarah, a sharp analyst whose ambition and determination reminded me of my mother. Janet's trial concluded with a plea deal. She avoided jail time but was required to pay restitution and was permanently barred from working in any financial role. The last I heard, she had relocated to Arizona to live with her sister. Tiffany remained in Boston, working as a teacher's assistant. Our interactions were minimal, mostly through occasional emails. My father threw himself into mending our relationship. He shared stories about my mother that he had kept locked away for years, how they had met at a business conference, their struggles to start her company, the late nights spent building their dreams. Each story brought back a piece of what had been lost. One evening, as we sorted through old photos in the attic, we stumbled upon my mother's business journal. Inside was a letter, addressed to me, written just weeks before she passed away. "My dearest Gabriella, I'm leaving you more than money. I'm leaving you the freedom to choose your path. Don't let anyone dim your light or tell you what you deserve. You're stronger than you know, smarter than they give you credit for, and capable of anything you set your mind to. Trust yourself. I do. Love, Mom." Those words became the guiding principle of my journey as I worked tirelessly to establish my business. I framed the letter and placed it in my office, serving as a constant reminder of both my origins and my aspirations. My father, having retired from his long-held job, dedicated his time to volunteering at a grief counseling center, helping families navigate their losses without losing themselves in the process. Occasionally, he would lend his expertise to my firm, offering insights shaped by years of experience, which perfectly complemented my own approach. Reflecting on these events 5 years later, I am struck by the profound changes that have taken place. My consulting firm has expanded to 3 cities, aiding pharmaceutical companies in optimizing their operations, just as my mother once did. The trust fund she left behind did more than secure my future, it became a foundation for others to build theirs. Last year, my father officially retired, though he still visits the office from time to time, mentoring younger employees. He believes that staying involved keeps him connected to my mother's legacy. Every Wednesday we share lunch, reclaiming the time lost to Janet's deceitful manipulation. The most important lesson I learned throughout this journey wasn't about wealth or betrayal, it was about the necessity of standing up for myself. My mother foresaw that one day I would need to fight for what was rightfully mine, and she ensured I had the means to do so. She taught me that real strength is not about sheer toughness, but about being prepared, patient, and knowing when to act. I still visit the house I grew up in from time to time. My father continues to live there, but it no longer feels the same. The walls have been repainted, the furniture rearranged, and any traces of Janet's influence have been erased. Last week, while in what used to be my mother's office, now transformed into a library, I discovered her collection of business books. Tucked inside one were handwritten notes about teaching me how to run the company one day. That moment was bittersweet. I never had the chance to learn from her directly, but I've been creating something of my own, infused with the lessons she left behind. Every choice I make in my business echoes her wisdom. The trust fund she established wasn't merely about financial security. It was about instilling in me the confidence to stand firm when others tried to take what was mine. Janet's attempt to steal my inheritance became an invaluable lesson. People will always reveal who they truly are, and the best way to respond is to be ready. In hindsight, I am grateful for those difficult years. They molded me into someone my mother would have been proud of. Not just someone who endures challenges, but someone who emerges stronger because of them. The family photo albums have been rearranged, preserving only the memories that matter. On my desk at work sits my favorite photograph, one of my mother and me in her office, both laughing over a moment now long forgotten. That image serves as a daily reminder. While some people seek to tear you down, others lift you up in ways that last a lifetime. On the anniversary of my mother's passing, my father and I visited her grave together. We brought fresh flowers from her favorite garden, a tradition we had begun that year. As we stood in quiet remembrance, I shared with him a letter I had recently discovered in her journal. He took the worn paper in his hands, reading it silently, his fingers trembling slightly as he absorbed her words. "She was always thinking ahead," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Even when she was fighting for her own life, she was fighting for yours too." In that moment, I understood that every effort I had made to honor her legacy, every time I chose to stand my ground, every decision to create something meaningful was, in truth, her final gift to me. "She would be so proud of you," my father said, his hand resting on my shoulder. "And I couldn't be prouder to call you my daughter." We stood together in silence, reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. Some wounds never completely heal, but love and resilience have the remarkable ability to turn even the deepest scars into sources of strength.